Mom said, "You'll be grateful one day," as she signed the paperwork, handing me over to a 50-year-old stranger. I was 16. She wasn't signing me up for a summer camp, a boarding school, or an exchange program. She was signing a legal consent form for underage marriage. In our state, at the time, parents could legally sign off on a minor getting married. And my parents did exactly that, all because this man, Richard, offered them the deed to a 3-bedroom apartment in a luxury building downtown. They literally traded their teenage daughter for granite countertops, a doorman, and a balcony with a city view. If you are reading this and thinking that things like this do not happen in modern America, I understand. I used to think the same thing. I thought human trafficking and arranged marriages for profit were things that only happened in movies or in distant countries. But betrayal does not care about geography. Betrayal happens in regular living rooms, across scratched dining tables, by the people who are supposed to protect you the most. Let me take you back to the beginning so you can understand the sheer weight of what they did to me. I grew up in a dying Midwestern town in a neighborhood that most people drove through with their doors locked. My parents were always struggling, always scheming, always complaining about how unfair life was to them. We lived in a cramped, moldy 2-bedroom apartment where the heat barely worked in the winter. Eviction notices were a regular decoration on our front door. The stress in our house was a thick, suffocating fog. My father drank too much and worked too little. My mother was obsessed with status, constantly watching reality TV shows about rich housewives, entirely detached from her own grim reality. Despite all of that, I loved them. I was a naive kid. I thought their struggles were just a rough patch. I got good grades, kept my head down, and dreamed of getting a scholarship to go to college. I just wanted to go to prom, hang out with my friends at the mall, and be a normal teenager. Things started getting weird right after my 16th birthday. My dad came home one night bragging about a new investor he had met at a bar. He said this man, Richard, was a real estate developer who was going to help our family get out of the gutter. I did not think much of it until a week later when Richard came over for dinner. I will never forget the moment I first saw him. He was 50 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than our car, and he smelled like heavy cologne and old tobacco. His eyes locked onto me the second he walked through the door. It was not a friendly look. It was the look of a man evaluating a piece of property. He smiled, showing perfect white teeth that looked completely unnatural, and he reached out to shake my hand. His skin was cold. I felt a deep, instinctive knot form in my stomach. Throughout dinner, my parents treated him like royalty. My mother, who usually never cooked, had spent hours making a roast. They laughed at all his terrible jokes. But the worst part was how they kept bringing the attention back to me. "Doesn't she have beautiful hair, Richard?" my mother asked, smiling at him. "She is so well behaved too. Never gets into trouble." "She is certainly a very pretty girl," Richard replied, staring right at me while taking a sip of his wine. Felt sick. I excused myself from the table early and went to my room, locking the door. I assumed he was just a creepy older man and that my parents were just kissing up to him for a job or a loan. I had no idea they were negotiating my price. The discovery of the truth did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing realization. Over the next month, Richard started showing up more often. He bought my parents a new television. He took us out to expensive steakhouses. Then, the gifts started coming directly to me. Designer purse. An expensive necklace. I tried to refuse them, but my mother would pinch my arm hard when he wasn't looking and hiss at me to smile and say thank you. One night, I woke up to get a glass of water. I heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was my parents. They were whispering, but the apartment was small and sound carried. "He is offering the penthouse unit," my dad was saying. "Completely paid off. The deed goes in our name the day after the ceremony." "But she is only 16, my mother whispered back. For a split second, I felt a surge of hope that she was defending me. That hope died instantly. What if the school asks questions? What if people talk? "Let them talk," my dad snapped. "We will be living in luxury. All we have to do is sign the parental consent forms. It is perfectly legal in this state. She moves in with him, we get the apartment. It is a win-win. I stood frozen in the hallway. My blood turned to ice. My vision blurred. I could not breathe. My own parents were selling me. They were selling me for an apartment. I ran back to my room, buried my face in my pillow, and sobbed until my throat was raw. I felt a level of heartbreak that I cannot even put into words. This was not a cheating boyfriend. This was not a friend talking behind my back. This was the ultimate betrayal. The two people who brought me into this world, the people who were supposed to jump in front of a train to save me, were throwing me onto the tracks to get a better view. The next morning I confronted them. I screamed, cried. I threw the designer purse Richard had given me across the room. I told them I would run away, that I would call the police, that I would tell everyone at school. My mother looked at me with cold, dead eyes. She didn't yell. She just sat there and delivered the most manipulative speech I have ever heard. If you do not do this, she said, her voice completely flat, we will be on the street next week. We are being evicted. Your father owes bad people a lot of money. You will end up in the foster system, and we will be homeless. Is that what you want? You are being selfish. Richard is a good man. He will take care of you. You will never have to worry about money again. You will be grateful one day. They broke me down. Over the next few weeks, they relentlessly ground down my spirit. They guilt-tripped me, cried, threatened suicide, and painted themselves as the ultimate victims. I was a terrified 16-year-old girl with no money, nowhere to go, and no one to turn to. I believed them when they said I would end up in a horrible foster home. I felt responsible for their survival. So I gave up. The day we went to the lawyer's office to sign the papers remains the darkest memory of my life. The office smelled like cheap coffee and lemon polish. Richard sat across from us, looking incredibly smug. He wore a sharp gray suit and kept tapping his expensive pen on the mahogany desk. My mother held my arm in a vice grip. The lawyer, a slimy man who clearly got paid well to ignore the moral rot of this situation, slid the paperwork across the table. My mother signed her name. My father signed his. Then they handed me the pen. My hand shook so violently I could barely hold it. I looked at my mother, begging her with my eyes to stop this. She just gave me a hard stare and nodded at the paper. I signed my name. I felt my soul detach from my body. We had a small, sterile ceremony at the courthouse 2 days later. I wore a plain gray dress. There was no music, no flowers. Just a judge who looked bored and stamped a piece of paper that legally bound me to a man more than 3 times my age. My parents hugged me outside the courthouse, got into a cab, and went straight to their new luxury apartment. They didn't even look back. I was taken to Richard's house. It was a massive, modern mansion in the wealthy suburbs. Felt like a museum. Cold floors, sharp angles, and completely silent. Living with Richard was a psychological nightmare. I want to be clear. He did not lock me in a basement. He did not tie me up. His abuse was entirely psychological and controlling. He viewed me as a prize, a pet, an exotic bird he had bought for his cage. He took away my old phone and gave me a new one that only had his number and my parents' numbers programmed into it. He monitored all my internet activity. I was not allowed to go back to my old high school. He hired private tutors to come to the house, claiming it was for my safety and prestige. He dressed me in clothes he picked out, expensive, conservative dresses that made me look like a middle-aged politician's wife. We went to boring dinners with his wealthy friends, where I was expected to sit quietly, smile, and act like a grateful trophy. His friends knew how young I was, and none of them cared. Money protects monsters. At night, the reality of my situation crushed me. I lay awake in the massive guest bedroom. Thank God he at least gave me my own room for the first few months, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my parents. I thought about them sitting on their new balcony, drinking wine, completely unbothered by the fact that they had sacrificed my childhood for their comfort. The anger I felt was a physical thing. It burned in my chest, made my hands shake. I hated them more than I hated Richard. Richard was a predator. He was acting in his nature. My parents were supposed to be my protectors. 8 months into this arrangement, things started to shift. Richard started drinking more. He started making comments about how I owed him more affection. He started grabbing my waist a little too tightly, looking at me with that same predatory stare from the first night we met. I knew my time as just a display piece was running out. The dread settled into my bones. I knew I had to leave. If I stayed, I would disappear completely. I would just become an extension of his furniture. I began to plan my escape with intense quiet. When I saved up enough money, I bought a cheap smartphone. I needed an outlet. I was carrying around so much trauma, so much anger, and so much confusion. I needed to talk, but I had no friends. So I started recording myself. I created an anonymous account on a social media platform. I didn't show my face at first. I just pointed the camera at the ceiling of my shelter bunk or out the window of the diner. I started talking about what it felt like to be betrayed by your own parents. I talked about the concept of being sold. I spoke rawly and honestly about the emotional weight of realizing you were nothing more than currency to the people who raised you. I posted the first video and went to sleep. When I woke up the next day, my phone was frozen from notifications. The video had exploded. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. People were shocked, horrified, and deeply empathetic. They wanted to know more. They wanted to know if I was safe. I kept making videos. I called my channel The Girl Who Was Sold. I documented my daily life. The struggle of working minimum wage, the fear of being found, the nightmares that kept me awake. I poured every ounce of my soul into those videos. I didn't use fancy editing or clickbait titles. I just told the brutal, ugly truth about human greed and parental betrayal. Community built around me. Other survivors of abuse started sharing their stories in my comments. I realized I wasn't just screaming into the void anymore. I was speaking for people who had been silenced. The day I turned 18, everything changed. I was legally an adult. Richard had no legal power over me anymore. My parents had no power over me. I went to a legal aid clinic and immediately filed for a divorce from Richard. Because I could prove I had abandoned the residence and we had been separated, and due to the extreme circumstances, a sympathetic judge fast-tracked the annulment. I was officially free. To celebrate, I did a face reveal on my channel. I sat in front of the camera, looked directly into the lens, and told my entire story. I named my parents. I didn't name Richard directly for legal reasons, but I described the situation in detail. The internet rallied behind me in a way I could never have imagined. My follower count skyrocketed into the millions. I started a YouTube channel and a podcast. I monetized my content. Within a year, I went from washing dishes to signing massive brand deals. I moved out of the shelter and rented a beautiful, safe apartment of my own. I started speaking at conferences, advocating for laws to ban underage marriage in the states where it was still legal. I turned my pain into power and my power into a career. I was 22 years old, successful, completely independent, and happy. I had built a family out of my friends and my community. I thought the ghosts of my past were finally dead. Then I got the email. It went to my business inquiry inbox. The subject line simply read, "Family business." I opened it and my heart dropped into my stomach. It was from my mother. "Hi honey. We saw you on TV last week talking about your podcast. You look so beautiful and successful. We are so proud of you. Things have been really hard for us lately. Richard kicked us out of the apartment 2 years ago after you left. He said the deal was broken. We have been living in a terrible motel and Dad lost his job. Since you are making so much money now, and since your whole career is based on the story we gave you, we think it's only fair that you help us out. You owe us at least a percentage of what you make. You wouldn't have this platform if we hadn't made the choices we made. Please send a check to this address. We expect to hear from you soon." I stared at the screen for an hour. My hands were shaking, but this time it was not from fear. It was from pure, unadulterated rage. The absolute audacity. The staggering, delusional entitlement. They didn't apologize for selling me to a predator. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't care about the nights I slept shivering in a shelter or the days I starved. They only saw me as a paycheck. They had tried to sell me once, and now they were trying to cash in on the trauma they had inflicted. My father left a voicemail on my public business line the next day. He sounded drunk. "You're an ungrateful brat," his slurred voice echoed from my phone speaker. "We set you up for life. We gave you your origin story. You think people would watch your little videos if you had a normal, boring life? You owe us. We are getting a lawyer if you don't pay up." I didn't block them. I didn't ignore them. The scared 16-year-old girl would have run away again. The 22-year-old woman I had become decided it was time to go to war. I hired the most ruthless, aggressive litigation attorney I could find. I showed him the emails. I played him the voicemail. I told him everything about the contract, the coercion, the emotional distress. They want money. I told my lawyer, let's give them a lawsuit. We sued them for everything we possibly could. We sued for intentional infliction of emotional distress. We sued for financial damages related to the coercion. We even found a legal loophole to sue them for unjust enrichment regarding the time they spent living in the luxury apartment while I was essentially held captive. When they received the summons, they panicked. They tried to call me, leaving crying voicemails, begging me to drop it, saying they were my parents and that family doesn't sue family. I felt absolutely nothing listening to their tears. They had lost the right to call themselves my family the moment they signed that consent form. The court case took over a year. It was grueling, exhausting, and forced me to relive every horrible moment. But I refused to back down. The day of the final hearing, I walked into the courtroom wearing a sharp, tailored suit. I held my head high. I sat next to my lawyer and finally looked across the room. My parents looked terrible. They had aged 20 years. My father looked haggard and defeated. My mother looked small, clutching her cheap purse, her eyes darting nervously around the room. They looked pathetic. The terrifying monsters of my childhood were just sad, greedy, broken people. When I took the stand, the defense attorney tried to rattle me. He tried to claim I was a rebellious teenager, that my parents were doing what they thought was best for my financial future, that I was just looking for revenge. I looked the attorney dead in the eye and spoke clearly. I detailed the terror of being forced to marry a predator. I detailed the nights I cried myself to sleep. I detailed the sheer horror of knowing my parents traded my body and my future for a piece of real estate. I read my mother's email out loud to the courtroom, the email where she demanded money for giving me my origin story. The judge, a stern-looking woman who had been taking furious notes, stopped writing and glared at my parents with absolute disgust. We won. The judge ruled in my favor on almost every count. The financial judgment against them was massive. I knew I would never actually see a dime of that money because they were broke, but that was never the point. The point was to bankrupt them legally, to put their crimes on public record, and to show them that they could never ever touch me again. They were legally required to stay away from me, and any further contact would result in immediate police action. As I walked out of the courtroom that day, my mother called out my name from the hallway. I stopped and turned around. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "We are your parents," she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do this to us?" I looked at her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt empty pity. "You sold your daughter for an apartment you couldn't even keep," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You told me I would be grateful one day. And you know what? You were right." She looked confused. "I am grateful," I continued. "I am grateful that I am nothing like you. I am grateful that I survived you. Now never speak to me again." I turned my back on her and walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight. It has been 3 years since that day. I am 25 now. I own my own home. I have a beautiful dog, a career I love, and a partner who treats me with genuine respect and kindness. I still go to therapy twice a week. The trauma doesn't just vanish because you win a lawsuit. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, smelling cheap coffee and old tobacco, feeling the ghost of a pen in my hand. But I am healing. Betrayal changes you on a cellular level. When the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor turn out to be the storm, you have to learn how to become your own anchor. It is the hardest, most unfair lesson a person can learn. But it is also deeply empowering. I lost my parents, my childhood, and my innocence. But I found my voice, found my strength, and most importantly, I found out that I am priceless.